So there's a bit of a split right now in Washington, D.C. We've got people inside of the Trump administration saying that, hey, everybody should be thanking the president for all of his efforts to try to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine. But meanwhile, we have Republicans, the same party as the current administration, just not currently in any of those roles, saying this is shameful for America, the route that we're taking, and we need to recognize that we're on the wrong side of history. And I thought it was worth running through a couple of these statements made just here in recent days, starting out with Secretary Rubio in the White House, of course, defending the administration's stance. He leads out by saying, hey, nobody is doing more for peace right now than President Trump. Let's give that a listen.
Of all the leaders in the world today, no leader is working harder to prevent wars or end them than President Trump is right now. That's why we're talking to Iran. That's why we're engaged with Ukraine and Russia. It's the desire to prevent these wars from breaking out and to end the ones that exist already. And again, I just think it's tremendous for our country to be led by a president who desires to bring peace and establish peace and protect peace. So it's hard work.
Okay, so to be fair, if we want somebody to defend the current administration's stance on any proposal, we just have to look inside the current administration, right? That's nothing new. And Secretary Rubio in this same meeting continued on defending the current policies, saying, look, we have shown Ukraine and Russia the way to end this. Everybody should just be thanking us. We've shown them how to get there. They just need to actually do the thing to end the war, which is very much at odds with the next couple clips we have here. But let's go ahead and listen to that. Secretary Rubio once again.
Well, first of all, what was put before our partners was options to discuss about things that it would take to end a war. This war is endable. Both sides just have to agree to it. We've shown them a pathway forward. We've discussed those ideas. There was a good meeting yesterday. There'll be good meetings over the weekend. We've shown them the finish line. We need both of them to say yes. But what happened last night with those missile strikes should remind everybody of why this war needs to end. It's horrible those missiles landed. What's even worse is there are today people that were alive yesterday that are not alive today because this war continues, and the president wants to stop it. And everyone should be thanking the president for being a peacemaker and trying to save lives. That's what we're trying to do here. It's not our war. We didn't start it, as you know. But we're trying to end the dying. We're trying to end the destruction. And we've shown the path forward. We can see the finish line, but both of them have to get there. We're going to do everything we can to help them get there, but they have to ultimately say yes.
Look, personal pet peeve, and I've talked about this before, but this idea that we just say, oh, we are so frustrated and angry that this dang war in Europe is just dragging on, and it's an affront to us that Ukraine and Russia won't end this thing, as though there are people in Ukraine especially that actually want this to continue. They want this war to be over long ago, right? By all indications at this point, we've seen Ukraine come to the table and offer up ceasefire proposals that just yesterday Russia shot down once again. So I don't know. It feels like we're making an argument against Ukraine here, and they're not actually saying that thing, if that makes sense. But nonetheless, former National Security Advisor John Bolton had something to say on CNN where he was talking about this, saying, listen, the issue here is that Trump and his team, they don't understand at all what's happening in this war. Give it a listen.
Well, in part because he doesn't understand what this war is all about. He has said several times, including in the State of the Union message, he thinks the war is senseless. For very different reasons, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians think that. The Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom and independence. The Russians are fighting to expand the Russian empire. That's a hard position to compromise, whether Trump thinks it's senseless or not. Anybody who understands this history would appreciate that this is going to be more difficult than Trump and Steve Witkoff think.
Now, look, I know Bolton's a controversial figure, and he has a lot of people on both sides of the aisle that don't necessarily like him, and he's certainly at odds with President Trump. But I think he raises a good point there. It doesn't do anyone any good to call a conflict that we're not directly involved in senseless or pointless or unnecessary. Like, if it was completely unnecessary, we have to assume that it probably would not have started in the first place, or at least would be easy to resolve. But look, Ukraine has a very valid reason to want to continue fighting. Just yesterday, there were major missile and drone strikes all across the country that killed a number of civilians. Of course, they're going to want to keep fighting to prevent that from happening in the future. And as Ambassador Bolton there talks about, Russia wanting to expand the Russian empire. That is a desired goal from Putin and senior leadership inside of Russia. They're going to continue doing it. You might disagree and say it's not a very good goal or not valid or morally or just, whatever it might be, but it doesn't do any good from the outside looking in to say, you know, this is an unnecessary war. It doesn't move the ball forward at all. But Bolton continued here, pretty long interview. We're just going to clip out a couple segments. But he was asked why we haven't really seen any progress so far, which we haven't. There's been talks, but there's been no tangible progress towards any sort of ceasefire, let alone an actual end to the war. And his take is because the ask on the table right now is for Ukraine to surrender. So, of course, that's not going to happen. Here you go.
Because that amounts to surrender for Ukraine. These are the Russian positions that then give them the basis after they regroup and rebuild their army for the third invasion of Ukraine to finish what Putin and the Kremlin began back in 2005, announcing it publicly to the world that they were about recreating the Russian Empire. And that includes, critically, getting control of Ukraine. This Trump approach to Russia, I think, is a critical mistake for the United States. This will be one of the biggest reversals of policy in history. It will have ramifications for American national security all over the world. And as Trump says, he doesn't really care about it. He just wants to do it to get the war behind him. That's all he really cares about.
And I think this is something that's missed a lot of times. People from the outside maybe looking in, especially that are just starting to get a glimpse of what's happening in this conflict, they say, how on earth could anybody argue against peace? And the issue there is not a question of peace versus war. It's a just peace, a stable peace, a peace that keeps for some period of time. What good is some sort of peace agreement that, a year, 2, 5, even 10 years later sets the stage for Russia to continue on with their aggression across Eastern Europe? We want to make sure that we get ahead of that, and we don't allow that to happen. So that's the difference here. Of course, everybody wants peace. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that doesn't genuinely want peace. It's peace on their terms. And for the United States and Ukraine and many of our allies, those terms are, we can't let Russia keep doing this. So we have to find a way to bring about an end to the war that prevents them from trying this again anytime soon. But on that note, kind of moving into the ceasefire negotiations, a hot topic recently has been Crimea, because it sounds an awful lot like what we've seen in a couple of these documents, that the United States is proposing that we will recognize Russian control, Russian legal ownership of Crimea in exchange for some sort of ceasefire. And Ambassador Bolton hit on that. He's not a fan, to say the least. Here you go.
If we recognize the Russian seizure of the Crimea and the annexation is legal, it would not only be contrary to American national security interest, it would be a mark of shame on the administration, on Trump, on Vance, on everybody in the administration who supported it. And it would be an open license for other countries to take aggressive action. I don't think people are focused enough on how the rest of the world will read this.
And this is what's causing some of the division right now, or the splits inside of even the right side of the political spectrum here in the United States, because it's not entirely clear why we're departing so far from very recently held beliefs when it comes to national security and foreign policy. So we can head over here to Fox News, where the chief political analyst, Brent Hume, is saying, I don't know what Trump is talking about. The problem here is not Zelensky, it's Putin. Everybody can see that, right? Here you go.
Well, he keeps pounding Zelensky and saying it's harder to deal with him than it is with Putin. Putin, so far as I can tell, hasn't agreed to much of anything, except, yes, he'd love to annex Crimea, which is part of the proposal that's before him now. That's no concession. All that is taking a gain. Zelensky resists that because Crimea, up until the Russia invaded it 10 years or so ago, was part of Ukraine. So I'm not exactly sure what the president is talking about when he says that Zelensky has been more difficult to deal with than Putin. There have been a series of ceasefire proposals. Putin either hasn't agreed to them or has immediately broken them. I'm not sure, what concessions Putin will ever be willing to make, but he certainly hadn't made very many so far.
I think confused is a good way to put it. He's like, what is happening that you guys are seeing that I'm not seeing? And we talked about this in a recent video where all of the blame is really being laid on Zelensky and Ukraine for this peace deal not coming together. But meanwhile, we've watched Russia now reject, 3 ceasefire proposals and continue to launch missiles and drones into Ukraine, showing no signs that they're actually interested in bringing about an end to this war. So I can understand the confusion, because I too am confused about why we look at all of this and say the biggest problem by far and away is Ukraine. But nonetheless, that's where we are. There was an interesting clip here also that just came out from Nikki Haley, a former United Nations ambassador and former governor of South Carolina, again, a Republican, so the same party that we currently have in the administration. I should note that Haley ran in the primaries to possibly be a presidential candidate this time around. Didn't make it very far, but there's a little background there. And she mentioned in a clip yesterday that, looking at this conflict, we have to know the difference between right or wrong. Like, that is clear as day. We have to recognize it is there and take appropriate action. Here you go.
But at the end of the day, aggressors do what aggressors do. If we allow this Russian aggression to be rewarded, they will do it again. It's what he does. If he sees he gains land and is not punished for it, he will do it again. If we punish Ukraine for trying to protect themselves, what are you saying to freedom-loving countries everywhere? There are only certain times that we can look back and say, we have to know the difference between right and wrong. This is one of those times.
So that whole right and wrong history look kind of reminds me of what we heard from former Vice President Vance during the campaign, where he was kind of hammering that point. Like, hey, this is an expansionist Russia. We can't allow this to happen. What world are we living in where people are actually upset with Ukraine on this one? It's weird. So I thought to wrap it up today, we would actually look at a clip from Mark Short, who is the former chief of staff for Vice President Vance during his time serving as vice president for President Trump. And he was on CNN talking about this whole situation a couple days ago. And he said, look, I think Trump's looking weak at this point. But let's go ahead and give that a listen.
For it. Well, I think something else. I think it looks really weak, which I think is something the president does not like, that image. But right now, I think he looks weak in these negotiations. But I think we're also forgetting, that when Russia invaded, the sort of general wisdom was that Russia will overtake Ukraine in a matter of days or weeks. They survived for 3+ years and actually were degrading Russia's military significantly. Russia was needing Iran to provide drones, China to provide money, North Korea to provide troops. And so Ukraine was more than holding its own if they just were to get support from the world to say, we're going to stop a murderous dictator from invading our country.
So that's something else that's just been confusing throughout this entire process. From everything I can see, Russia is listening to what we say and going, yeah, no, it's either not good enough or we're just going to ignore it. It is hard to see any leverage the United States has added to Russia in recent weeks or months, and that just doesn't seem to jive with most of the other Trump policies. Like, you can see in most other arenas, he really wants to present as the upper hand and having the negotiating power, right? That's very much a Trump thing, and we're not seeing it in this case. So, I don't think it is a far cry, and you're hearing this in Russian media, by the way. Now, take that for what it's worth, but there's people in Russia saying, we got this. Things are moving in our direction. Putin is winning the negotiations. We've got the upper hand. And that seems very contradictory to what we would normally expect out of Trump. In fact, an argument before he was elected was, listen, he's not going to like that. He's going to try to tell Putin what to do. Putin is not going to do it. And then Trump's going to get pissed off because he's being shown up a little bit. And who knows? We might see American F-16s patrolling the skies over Western Ukraine, or ATACMS for as many targets as there could possibly be in Russia. That was an argument, whether it was valid or not. And it seems like we're seeing the first part of that, where Trump may not necessarily have the upper hand in these negotiations, but we're not seeing the follow-up of him trying to levy that or level out that scale, if you will. But nonetheless, I thought it was interesting to run through a couple examples here, both of, starting out with administration officials, obviously, as you would expect, backing the current negotiation strategies, but then shifting over to others inside of the Republican Party, so on the right side of the political aisle here in the United States, pushing back and saying, not little pushbacks, right? We've got Ambassador Bolton saying that this is an embarrassment to the United States. It can be a stain on our history. We've got Ambassador Haley, former governor, saying we have to know the difference between right and wrong, and others just saying, I have no idea what's even happening here. This is so confusing. So thought it was worth running through and giving you an idea of some of the thought process out there. But anyways, that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.